and welcome to the About That podcast with me, your host, your favorite geek psychologist, your favorite pop culture enthusiast, your favorite queen of the nerds, Dr. Vanessa Hintz. And welcome to all, and welcome back to some, to this second part of my conversation with Dr. Leandra Parris and Benjamin Taitz, focused on the, in some places, banned graphic novel Mouse by Art Spiegelman. Our first conversation, which was absolutely amazing, albeit unbiased, still absolutely amazing, focused a lot on the narrative itself and the impact of banning narratives and some considerations there. And this concluding part of our conversation is really going to be focused on intergenerational trauma, and not just sort of the quote negative aspects of it, but also the power that narratives like Mouse have for healing and have for empathy building and all types of things. And so, without further ado, I bring to you, wonderful folks, the conclusion of our conversation about Mouse.
Why can't we also look at other aspects of humanity that we're not so great that we want to be better? Like, why is it only when certain white people, because also our listeners cannot see, you look at me on the street, you think I'm white. Apparently Jews don't count as white. So unless you don't know I'm Jewish, in which case I can have the privilege of being a white person. I recognize that. I do have a lot of privilege as a white appearing person. But the second the conversation turns around anti-Semitism and Jewishness and everything like that, then my whiteness goes away. So it's a very confusing thing for me. Because again, my school would have had those kinds of conversations about racism in America as it pertained to white Americans versus African Americans and other people of color, but Jews were not included in any of that. So where do I fall?
Yes.
What color am I? And it just literally the question, what color am I, just popped into my head. I was watching this anime called Psychopaths, not related to this at all. It's about, dystopian future, murderers and stuff like that. It's like a, fictional crime, anime thing. But in that universe, society is controlled by this like computer system that can measure a person's criminal potential through a color of your like hue, and your like reading your brains or whatever. Like, so if you have a lighter, brighter color to your mental scan, then you're calmer, that you're more healthy mentally and whatnot. So problematic there too. Our listeners
Anime, do better.
Yeah, right. But one of the serial killers in the second season or whatever, he's not able to be read by the system. He's manipulating the system, and he's asking this question: "What color am I?" Because it's questioning the system and whatnot. And I like that here, because yes, we need to question the system. Some people don't fit neatly into these categories that we as society have introduced, or they only fit in when it's convenient. And anti-Semitism, racism, they're one and the same, because Judaism, so being Jewish is a race and ethnicity and a religion. We're the only group that I can think of off the top of my head that has that. I'm sure there are others. Just the fact that in America, we'll separate those discussions as being separate. Anti-Semitism over here, racism over here, to deal two different races. Why is racism only talked about with one group? I get it, that group is horribly treated, but racism as a term, just by definition, doesn't specify what race. So why can't we combine the narratives? African Americans have a history of oppression in America, as do literally every other minority. Jewish people have a history of oppression in America. Why did those conversations have to be separate? Because if we put them together, then oh no, that's like not okay. Because then there's too much light being shined on the problems of systems in America, or in the world. Because spoiler alert, Jews and Black people are treated badly in other countries too, particularly former British territories and the Empire. That in and of itself, I see it as another way to not tell these narratives, and picking and choosing which oppressed narratives to share to the world. Well, what? This is my lived experience. Who are you to tell me that it's not valid?
I wanna address something that you said, because I think as a Black person, as a descendant of like enslaved peoples, I think there is merit for having different conversations. I think what happens is when we start to play the oppression Olympics, which is what is not healthy. Like, the Holocaust was so much worse than these are not the conversations.
No, it's not
Exactly.
about who was worse.
Exactly.
The system does that specifically to make sure we never have those conversations together.
Well, yeah, because then we realize that the real winner is just oppression as a whole.
Yes.
So that's why I don't like that we're taught that, society is saying, oh, anti-Semitism over here, racism against certain minorities over here. It's all oppression. It's all racism. It's all shit.
Yes. And I think it's interesting, because I do think that as a person of color, and I'm going to be very transparent, I think one thing that when we talk about the difference between racism and anti-Semitism that comes up in the conversation is that, and you referenced it, Ben, like there is a privilege of being white. Like there is a privilege that you have of being white. And that does not negate the oppression that you experience as a Jewish person. And I think what often also comes up in the conversation is how, when we look at statistics in America, there is a very wide wealth gap between people who identify as Jewish and people of color. And again, that is not to say that doesn't mean that means you don't experience oppression. It means it looks different. And so that's why I feel like those conversations are different. But what happens, and Leandra just referenced it, the oppressor wants us to fight each other as opposed to fighting oppression and the language of whiteness and systems of supremacy. And so that's why I think that these narratives are important, because again, as a Black person, as a descendant of enslaved Africans, I understand intergenerational trauma from slavery. I do not understand intergenerational trauma from descendants of the Holocaust. And this story allowed me, as we mentioned, to bear witness to that. Not to say they had it so much worse than them, because those are not the conversations we need to be having. The conversations we need to be having is how all of this is terrible. We are still seeing this history. Again, you said your grandfather, that is 2 generations removed, right? We're not talking about ancient history. We're talking about someone who could very well still be alive today, right? And so I think that what the conversations needs to be about these narratives is what is, and this is a great segue, I promise I didn't do this on purpose, but how do the effects of these atrocities reach into the present? And I think part of it is exactly what we're describing now, which is, let's just continue to separate like your oppression and the oppression of these people and the oppression of these people. Which one is worse? That's the one we're going to deal with today. When it's all, like you said, it's all shit. It's all terrible. And so I think that this is a good segue into the conversation about intergenerational trauma. And Leandra, I'm going to start with you. When we think about, again, how the effects of these traumas and these horrors show up today, and we've been talking about it some, but Leandra, I'm going to invite you to talk a little bit about not only what it looks like for young people, but then what it looks like for us just as a society collectively.
Yeah, I think one of the things I picked up on more the second read of Mouse was Artie himself kind of being like, why is my dad like this, right? Like, why is he saving everything? Like, why would you get rid of mom's diaries randomly and burn them all when you've had them? Like, so I think there's a lot of, you learn things from people who've experienced trauma when you're a child because you're modeling their behaviors. And so one of the things that's really always kind of my like foundation for understanding this is there's all these studies where a child will look at usually a mom, because scientists were still sexist. We think moms are the ones that the only ones. And as someone raised by her dad, I will say that's not true. But the child will look at the parent, and the child cannot see what's behind them at all. They're just told what's behind them. And then the parent, the caregiver, is told to have a reaction. And so let's say there's a bird, a picture of a bird, and the child sees the parent react with fear. And they see this enough that the next time they actually see a bird, the child will react with fear, even though they've never actually seen the bird that the parent was reacting to. So what ends up happening is that you learn these fear, fight, flight, fawn responses to things that you didn't experience yourself, but it is part of your family, your community's defense and coping, and then sometimes healing. Like, I don't want to make it all just these like fear responses. Sometimes it is a healing mechanism that gets sort of passed down. And so what ends up happening, I think about Indigenous populations in general around alcoholism, is that you have people who have no social support, who've been ripped away. There was the big sweep in the 60s where they came in and took Indigenous children and gave them to white families. You think about being like ripped out of your social support, you have very little connection. And then when you find that connection again, or that connection is hurt, it creates these patterns, right, of maladaptive coping, blah, blah, blah. That's all scientific. The end of the day is trauma doesn't stop. We always think of trauma like big T trauma has a beginning and an end, but the coping and the healing is lifelong. And how children see that occurring really influences how they themselves understand and experience stressors and trauma, and how they're going to cope and experience that. And so when I was reading through Mouse, I'm like, oh my gosh, this is this is exactly what we see with the children and the bird and the caregiver, right? Of someone having these experiences where I don't know if I can talk about Auschwitz and draw this next part of my book. I wasn't there, but I still don't know that I can do it. I have to be in therapy to do this. That is a very real, almost involuntary, sometimes voluntary passage of coping mechanisms. And I think that's another reason the narratives are so important, because processing narratives, and I think I would hope Spiegelman was like doing this, was kind of healing for me to be able to process through all of these things. Although there's that part in the book where it doesn't look like it was like super great when he was like crying for his mom. And part of that processing is to be able to have that social support, to have that connection, and to understand, not to say it's wrong, not to say that it's right, we have these reactions, not to pass judgment, but to just simply understand where this comes from. And I think about, for me, and I could only speak about this as from a woman, when I'm walking by myself on campus, there's woods, right? And I have to walk down this path. If there's a certain time of day where if I do that, I feel afraid. I have no reason to feel afraid, except that generation upon generation of women know that if you're by yourself in a wooded area and a man walks by, you probably should figure something out, right? That is just that is my body telling me, after generation of generation of rape and sexism, you are not safe. And this comes up in Mouse so much, and I didn't understand it. Like you said, I didn't understand that from the perspective of a Jewish person until I read Mouse. So it doesn't seem valid to me until I understand it. So that's why it's so, so important when we think about understanding not just what happened to people during World War II and during the Holocaust, but what is still happening to everyone who had.
And also how this has been happening even before. Because
Yes.
I mean, to go back to Vanessa's thing, okay, the enslavement of Africans in America, that was quote unquote a long time ago. Let's talk about how throughout history these groups have been treated by those in power. You know, for me, Jews for a long time in history, until only the modern day, Jews were not allowed to hold certain jobs in certain areas. The reason why there's a stereotype about Jews and money and hoarding money is because back in like medieval times, the only job the Jews were allowed to have was tax collector. Because in Christian teachings at the time, to handle money was dirty. So, I mean, first of all, people don't like tax collectors, you know, and so that then turns into, oh, the Jews are taking our money. Well, that was the only job we were allowed to have. Like we literally were not allowed to have any other position. It was either farmer, or merchant, where you had to give favored deals to other people, but not to yourself, or tax collector. Basically, handling things that the people in power did not want to handle. We see how that trickles down throughout history. That how the experience of Jews back in those days, Renaissance time, and all that jazz, and how Black people have been treated in America from the founding of America, and even technically before the founding of America, because that slavery stuff was going on before America was America. Spoiler alert to people who did not read that part of the chapter in history books, because it wasn't there.
Yeah,
it wasn't
contrary
in the book.
to Williamsburg, this is not the birthplace of America, by the way.
Yes.
Anyone from Williamsburg listening, you're not living in the birthplace of America.
So it's, this is how that intergenerational trauma is played out. This is what we know. This is what we're allowed. These are the places you are allowed to be. This is the way you are allowed to live. This is the way you're allowed to express life. And so that trickles down. And then we have these responses that we don't know where they came from, because again, we don't talk about those stories. Part of intergenerational trauma for a lot of people, not just, with oppression, is secret keeping, right? Like we don't talk about things. The people in the oppression don't want to talk about it. Growing up, there are certain things we don't talk about. I don't know why we don't talk about it. Not until I was older. I mean, my dad was really good about like telling us my grandfather's story, but as a child, it was only told as like he survived and he escaped. So kind of the good side of it. But I was still aware as a child that there was loss, that there was, trauma, that there was massacre. But in the community, and this is something that I still kind of struggle with, is that the community as a whole only talks about it when it's the right time to talk about it, on Holocaust Remembrance Day. Right? Why can't we talk about how Jews have been treated before the Holocaust? We talk about, Jewish enslavement in Egypt only around Passover. Jewish joke, it's not a Jewish holiday unless we're talking about how we've been oppressed. But we only talk about those oppressions at that holiday. Again, the secret keeping or the curation of the narratives is being continued by the oppressed, by the people in that community. And I find that right now, as we're having this discussion, just mind-boggling, because we want people to hear us, but we don't even want to hear it ourselves. Like we want to be treated like human beings, as everybody does, but we won't even talk about it to ourselves, to the people in our group. Now, how can we explain it to other people? How can the people like Leandra, who had no connection to it growing up, how can we explain it to her if we won't even tell it to ourselves?
And I will say, as I can only speak to my experience, but I think that what I have come to understand, and it's again with years of wisdom and education, that is people, I find that people don't talk about it because of and again, this is not a detriment, but I think people don't know how. I also think people are worried about what will happen after they open the floodgates, right? Like I even think about traumas, I'm a biracial Black person. My mom is white and my dad is Black. And so there is people in my family who have, again, long-standing histories of racial oppression. And there are people in my family who absolutely have intergenerational traumas that have nothing to do with systemic oppression and have everything to do with the experiences that they just had, growing up in the family, whatever. And I have found that in both of those instances, part of the reluctance to disclose or talk about it is like, well, why would we do that? What is the value in that? What are we supposed to do with that? And I think me as a now I'm like super educated and stuff, but also, as a psychologist or, as an equity professional, being able to share with people in my family, this is what we're going to do with that. Everything that we're talking about in this conversation to me is educational for people about what you can do with something that is just so like horrible to fathom, right? To think about the Holocaust, to think about genocide, to think of, Native American genocide, to think about enslavement is horrendous. And you know what I'm saying? I think that is where people who do what we do in terms of healing and mental health, and I would also argue equity, diversity, and inclusion, what is healing about this? And again, also, we talked about at the very outset, just bearing witness, what the value of that is, because I think people don't, like, I have heard so many times from my father, right, as somebody who is a baby boomer, a Black man that grew up in Louisville, Kentucky his entire life, right? Like, what is the, like, we got to keep it pushing. What is the purpose of thinking about that? What is the purpose of thinking about the past? And that is absolutely due to intergenerational trauma, right? Like, we don't have time to stop and think about this and feel. That's what white people get to do, and only certain white people, as we're saying, right? Like, privileged people get to stop and feel because they have intergenerational wealth that will support them. They have all these different things. People who are marginalized, we don't get space to do that. And so I think if we want to do what you're describing, Ben, in terms of like sharing, and I think part of what we have to do in our collective communities is make safe spaces for that. Because again, I think about, that was one thing that was very striking to me about this story of Mouse, Art's sort of parallel journey of coming to the scene in the book with the therapist, to me, is the one that I like keep returning to, right? Because he was really small and then he got big, it was just such a beautiful piece. But he said, the therapist said to him, do you feel guilty that your father had to go through all of that and you didn't? And I was like, damn, like, you know what I'm saying? Damn. And I think about that as a Black woman in 2023. Could I have dealt with what my ancestors did? Absolutely fucking not. Absolutely fucking not. I don't think I could, right? And so there is a piece of me that always feels like I have to do better. I have to be better, because why did they go through all of that if I'm just going to be out here bullshitting? And I think that, again, in spaces where we're talking about these narratives, that even what I just said is problematic, right? Because I'm like pushing myself to the point of exhaustion because I feel guilty about what Black people endured. And so I think what we're talking about right now in terms of how we can talk about these narratives in a way that is, again, healing and valuing and bearing witness, as opposed to, again, what I think has been historically, I don't want to say has been, what can happen historically, which is you just not gonna do nothing and your ancestors died for this, you just gonna sit there and not do nothing. That is also problematic, right? And so how we as a community negotiate our feelings about these past traumas, I think, is very important, which is why this story, this conversation that we're having about this story and others like it, are like very, 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 very important.
And I would say also important, like coming from an ally perspective, like the reason these narratives are so important to have that we read as children, that become part of society's narrative, is so that you don't have to tell the story to the person sitting next to you every single time. I can pick up this book and learn this story. As an ally. I do not require that you, Ben, or you, Vanessa, tell me. I don't have to have you re-traumatize yourself and give me trauma porn if this narrative is already available to me by someone who, I'm sure this was very, very difficult and it was a hard thing, and they chose this path of healing and they chose to put this work out there. And so it's not on me as an ally to judge what path, like you were saying, do you rest or do you keep working? That is your control and your autonomy and your empowerment that I'm here to support. I don't judge that. I go find all the different paths and listen to all of them as an ally. And I think what really upsets me when we think about transgender children, when we think about children of color, when we think about Indigenous children, Jewish, add them all in there, who's telling their story? They are not capable of doing that right now. If we are not allowing those stories to be there, it's just like that intergenerational wealth you were talking about. I have reactions and things that I do for coping as a white woman that I learned from watching my white women family members that are not okay, that perpetuate my own power and privilege. And I do not think it's on my friends to tell me what those things are, but how am I going to do it if that narrative is not available for me to read for myself? And so part of it is you're not only taking away the narratives of the marginalized individuals, you're taking away the ability for children with power and privilege to recognize where they are in that story and how to change it.
Yeah.
And so it takes away everyone's power. And I wish people could understand that situation.
Yeah. That is kind of like what Vanessa was saying, is the trauma Olympics, if even the privileged people aren't allowed to hear it, then it's still only about, oh, well, see, these people are just complaining. How many times throughout history, has there been, tales about, book burnings and, banning books or thought control, thought police, right? Like there's a lot of fiction books about it. What was that? 1985 or something like that?
And those are all required. Can we just
yeah,
those are all required.
But because that's
Jones, by the way, also has a whole book burning thing, and my son's like, that's not okay. And I'm like holding up mouse as I'm reading it, and I'm like, you're right, it's not.
Yeah, it's not right. But it's like those books are allowed because they're fictional. It's not real. So it's an abstract concept. The thought police is an abstract concept, but it's not abstract in human history, and it's not abstract in human presence in certain areas of society, of human society, not just American society, of human society. I can't remember the author's name right now. A book called *Sapiens*, about evolution of human civilization and whatnot. Yuval Noah Harari, that was his name, Jewish guy. And he talks about how humans evolved into the societies that we have through communication, through storytelling, through gossip. And the ability, the act of stopping a story is not a new thing. That we were doing that before we had like really formalized language. Like I'm trying to like imagine cave people be like ugh. No, you can't say ugh, like
wiping away stuff.
Yeah, right. Like that was going on. This is how humans formed groups, was through storytelling. And the biggest so the reason why people have, my belief, and this is just my personal belief about the evolution of anxiety about speaking truth and stories, is because in our early evolutionary history, if the stories we were telling was not approved, we would be exiled from the tribe. Where were we then? In the wilderness with lions and tigers and bears and dinosaurs. Oh my. Like, I'm pretty sure they were all together about that. History taught me that. But exactly. So there was an actual existential threat to speaking stories that were not approved. And that, to me, this is how I understand the power of intergenerational trauma with regards to telling stories. And so it shows that book banning, and I'm using air quotes because our listeners could totally see me, this controlling of thought, controlling of narratives and stories has been around since we've evolved, since we had language, since we had verbal communication, well before written communication. And I think I agree with you, Vanessa, we need to create these spaces that allow people to have that, because again, that like intergenerational wealth and everything like that. When you were saying, oh, we don't have the luxury to feel, that hit me also, because Jewish culture is also, like, especially like Eastern European Jewish culture, is very much emotions are a luxury. You got to work, you got to prove yourself, you got to get wealth, you got to be stable before you can have that. And that it makes sense based off of how oppression works. Like, if there are only certain jobs you can do, then you have to be the best in that.
Yes.
Because if you're not the best, there's the shame that we put on ourselves of, oh my God, I'm an embarrassment to my ancestors. But then there's also the systemic oppression of, oh, well, see, you're not really good at this, so I guess we shouldn't allow your people to have these jobs.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not solely Jews' history. African Americans, Black people around the world, any marginalized community, what stories you're allowed to tell, what employment you can have,
Mm-hmm.
what places you can go.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, these stories are parallel
Mm-hmm.
and they intersect.
Yes. Yes.
So it's not parallel line that's it's the scores of a DNA. That's the image in my head. Because there are moments where they are parallel and there are moments when they intersect. Because this is just human evolution. And it might seem a bit, I don't know, dark or nihilistic or whatever, but humans suck.
Mm-hmm.
And
Um,
we can be better than
and
that.
we
Like,
can be better. This is why I love stories like Star Trek. Stories like Star Trek show that, okay, yes, humans were sucky and we can do better. So how do we do better? Like that is the premise of Star Trek. It's not about good versus evil in the classical archetypal sense. It's okay, well, I recognize that there have been aspects of my people's history that did not work, that were not healthy. So let's, as a society, strive to make those changes. And spoiler alert to people who have not seen Star Trek, it's not perfect in the 25th century. But they try. And that's what matters, is that they recognize that things are not perfect and they still continue to try. Then when they're faced with that, like, realization that their perfect utopia is not perfect, what do? They don't just hide behind like, no, we're fine. Like, how dare you say that about the Federation? No. Okay, this aspect of the Federation is not working. What can we do about it? This is not okay. This is not what we are supposed to be.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So
I love that
I,
you
go ahead.
brought up the feeling thing, because in Mouse, the father kept saying, "It is what it is," or like whatever.
that's
And
such a
it's
Jewish
like,
thing. Oh my God, it's such a Jewish
oh
thing.
my gosh. And like, just like I also felt like my grandmother would say similar things because she grew up like, very economically marginalized. And so like she would say these like horrible things that would happen because that she'd be like, oh, it is what it is. Thank you for pointing that out, because now I'm like, oh, that's what that is.
Mm-hmm.
And I think when you brought the intersection piece, I think that was also really important, because there is that part in Mouse where the father is racist and like doesn't want them to
Mm-hmm.
pick up the black hitchhiker. I actually think they were a hitchhiker, but that's what they
Yeah.
call them. So I think that there is that othering piece that you brought up, and it's so fascinating that you took it all, because I was going to be like, oh, we look at the Holocaust and like the rise of nationalism and book banning and censorship. It's always the first step into like mass genocide, but you just took it all the way back to like the beginning. That was like,
Well, I read the book *Sapiens* in college because I was taking evolutionary psych, and granted, my professor didn't talk about that aspect of evolutionary psych for some reason, but he did talk about evolutionary reactions to like jealousy and like monogamy, quote unquote monogamy, and gender roles. He went far into the whole like gender roles and sexism and everything. So I was like, okay, well, what else about humans today can we understand from humans of the early history? I mean, that's the whole point about that. Isn't that why we have the field of psychology, to understand human behavior? Well, if we are understanding it, but we're not, allowed to share it, then that doesn't do anyone any good. And there's unfortunately a very long history in the history of psychology of, again, only privileged people were allowed to understand psychology, and also really horribly unethical experiments, but that's again another podcast episode. But again, very privileged, educated intelligentsia and all that stuff, right? Like psychology, history, just education in general, like
Mm-hmm.
not just higher education, high school education. For long periods of human history, only certain groups are allowed to even have formal education.
Mm-hmm.
This is just the continuation of the story of who's allowed to tell stories.
Mm-hmm.
If only certain groups have formal education, and formal education is where these stories are told, well, then only certain stories will be told.
and formal education is valued in a way that narrative storytelling is not. So
Yeah.
especially in the Western world. But I think one thing that you mentioned too about Star Trek, and I'm on the out group here because y'all know I don't know nothing about Star Trek, but to the
We
point that
can
you're
fix that.
making about like we see what happened that we want to do better. I think what we're seeing now with the efforts to ban books and the efforts to ban certain narratives, there's not even any type of acknowledgement that people had different experiences in the past. So the people in power are saying, no, this is how it was historically. And marginalized people are like, for you, maybe. And there's
Yeah.
not a space for there to exist, other worldviews to exist. That is the entirety of equity, diversity, and inclusion work, right? Is making spaces for other worldviews to exist. And so what is happening, though, is that, again, folks in power are saying, no, 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 no. If you're not telling this version of history, then it's wrong, or we're not allowing that. So how are we to learn from a history that we can't even, I don't want to say agree upon, because it's not about agreeing upon what happened. It's
Just
about
like
allowing.
knowledge.
Exactly. And, again, and I think this conversation about the youth, right? We're indoctrinating
Mhm.
the youth. Validation is not indoctrination. Validating that someone had a different experience is not indoctrination. And so I think that again is a whole other conversation for a whole different day. But
We
I
can come
do
back for
think,
episode 2 of this
I'm
podcast.
saying, and I think that, and the last thing I'll say before we sort of wrap the conversation up, but you mentioned, Ben, the intersections of these sort of parallel stories of oppression, right? And I think at the intersections is where those trauma Olympics happen, right? And so it's like
Mhm.
I can't, and that's where again people who do DEI work are important and valuable, because again I can both, and this I can both acknowledge that your that atrocity was horrible, and this one was too. But I think in those
Mhm.
intersections, because again of the language, and Esther Amal calls this like the global language of whiteness, we are not allowed to both end. It's an either
Yeah.
or. Either the Holocaust was terrible or slavery was terrible. They can't be both. And why can't it
Yeah.
be both? Because the people who were responsible for both don't want you to, you know what I'm saying, recognize that. And so
Well,
I think
yeah. Well,
that.
it's like they're allowed to, in the white power people in America will allow the topic of African slavery to exist in schools,
Hmm.
but there's Holocaust denial
Yes.
happening. They won't teach, they won't even acknowledge that the Holocaust existed, that the Holocaust happened.
Or
So
even
again,
accept
it's
peers.
one,
Like,
it's the people in power deciding which version of history happened, but that's not the case. And what you're saying about validation is not, all that. And that's exactly the point, is that that's what, my therapeutic modality is DBT and ACT, acceptance commitment, because it's just, okay, yes, you have this feeling, and
Yes, and
how do we want to like move forward?
this conversation has been so amazing, enlightening. I'm feeling it like in my chest, like a tightness in a good way. And again, I want to thank you both so much for your time, for sharing of your knowledge, and also sharing just personally what the experience of reading this book was like for you, but also again how we can again use it as an opportunity to help people understand other narratives, but also as an opportunity for healing. And so I'm gonna ask you both, and we'll start with you, Ben. What is it that you hope people take away from this conversation today?
I think I would hope that people take away that it is okay to have different stories being told, that even if it's different than what you understand, even if it's different than what you were taught or what you believe, that's valid. It's just another perspective. I mean, human nature is so varied anyways. Why do we have to limit ourselves? So a lot, just acknowledge that stories exist and everybody has a different perspective. And if you're able, if you're in a space where you can hold that kind of space for another story, I welcome that and I invite you to do that if you are able, if it is comfortable for you, if you're in a physical environment where you can do that. But if you're not able to do that openly, then I encourage you to maybe find a little space inside where you can just have a little bit of, both and. both my history is valid and another person's experiences is valid. And that's it. We don't need to go any further. We don't need to judge. We don't need to question anything. Just acknowledge. I would hope that people can take that space for themselves where and when they feel able. And if anything in this conversation was really hard for somebody, I encourage you all to please take care of yourself, self-care, reach out to your loved ones if you need to, if that's how you do it. Reach out to a mental health professional if you feel that is what you need, but just take care of yourselves. This is a very heavy topic.
Spoken like a true therapist. Yes, I appreciate that 100%. And where can people find you if they want to find you on social media?
They can find me through my 2 podcasts. Mental Health Quest is on Facebook and Twitter at MHQ Podcast. And My Hero Therapy is on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at My Hero Therapy. And you can listen to Mental Health Quest wherever podcasts are found. And My Hero Therapy, we have a trailer episode out. And episode 1 is being edited as we speak and will be out soon. And that will also be on like Apple and Amazon and all that good stuff.
Yes, be sure to check those out, good people. Leandra, what would you hope people take away from our conversation today?
To read. I think to go out and find the stories that you wouldn't normally read, find the authors you don't normally follow. When you go to museums, read the little placards because those are telling you the story of what you're seeing. Like, don't just look at it, actually read through it. To fully understand who we are as a society, you need to know all those stories. And so go out and read and tell your own story. I think Benjamin said it perfectly. If you can find a way to write your narrative and process your story, even if only just for yourself, you know, I'm here to help, but mostly it's for you to do that. And as you know, our would-be allies and accomplices, when someone chooses to honor you with telling you their story, listen. It's not yours to judge. It's yours to listen and support. And if that person isn't doing that with you, go find a book, go find a graphic novel, go find a video. There's so much out there for us to learn about from each other that the fact that we're choosing to not do that is shows how far we have not come as humans.
Spoken like a true narrative therapist. I'm here for it. And where, Leandra, can people find you if they're interested on social media?
I am like not really good with social media because my daughter takes my phone a lot. But if you want to find me and contact me, you can do it on Twitter at Parris Leandra.
Yes, and that's Paris with 2 R's?
Yes, not like the city in France.
Don't be getting confused, y'all. And again, I want to thank you both so much. This has just been so, I feel like this is cliche to say, but like my heart is full after this conversation because again, I was nervous, admittedly, coming into it because again, I felt this wasn't my conversation to have. And so thank you both for helping to create this space that was welcoming and allowed me to be vulnerable because of your vulnerability. So thank you. And I hope that everybody listening to this finds value and benefit in the conversation as well. So until next time, good people, take care.